Welcome to another episode of Agile Done Right. I'm your host, Michael Renna. Today we're going to tackle the topic of estimation. Of all the topics that we've been asked to cover on the podcast, this is clearly the most popular. And honestly, I'd be hard-pressed to find another topic that I thought was as critical as the idea of predictability. When I help companies with agile coaching and training, one of the most common topics and the sort of areas of need is establishing predictability. So we'll go into parts of that. Estimation is only one part of predictability, but we'll talk about that because it's a big part of it. So the first thing I want to cover really is, why is estimation important? I mean, there are folks in Agile that are part of sort of a no estimation belief that are, this idea, I think it's kind of a movement. It's called the no estimates movement, I think. And in truth, there are practices in Agile with things like Kanban where you can make a case that you're really not necessarily making discrete estimates for work. But even then, and I'll talk about that, even then in that model, you will estimate. You'll estimate with just a different sort of view and a different metrics on how much throughput the team is creating, and therefore you can look at a backlog and determine what should it take to get through a certain place in the backlog. So there's estimation done even in the areas, the commodity level sort of practices that people would say are part of the sort of no estimates thing. And again, it's just not the way it really works. But estimation is so important for a lot of different reasons. And I want to start really by making sure people understand, why is estimation important, right? And the first thing I would say is time to market is important. It's more important now than it's ever been in the digital age, with the expectation from consumers that things will be delivered quickly, and the competitive landscape that says, look, if you don't deliver quickly, and especially for large companies that struggle with time to market and startups and lots of new technology and AI and low code, no code scenarios, means a small company can easily eclipse a large company with innovative and disruptive technology. So the time to market is so critical. So understanding what it's going to take to get something to market is also critically important. And in fact, it really drives, in many cases, investment decisions. So one of the things that we coach on when we get to the portfolio level are things like lean portfolio management and economic models for making decisions on how you invest. Well, part of that model, particularly weighted shortest job first, which we're always promoting, the denominator in that formula is an estimate: cost, size, duration. They all can be sort of used interchangeably. But understanding what something will take to produce to your best of your ability, and in many cases it might be relative, is it more or less than something else, that will drive the business decisions on what the best economic profile, what the sort of profile, the best economic outcomes for a company will be. So that estimation is part of that economic model for investment decisions. So we have to have some idea, with all the things on the table, what it's going to take to get something to market and make the right decisions, right? It also helps us understand our budget. I mean, when we even in value stream funded companies where we know what our budget is for our pool of resources for a given period, the estimation helps us understand what can we do in that period with the resources we have, and it can drive budget conversations as far as, do we need to increase the pipe? Do we need to increase the ability and capacity to be able to produce things so we can get more of these things done? So it's important for that. The other thing is, companies that have, there's a lot that goes on beyond just creating an innovative technology. Estimation allows for roadmaps and release planning. So, marketing and all these other groups that are critically important, support and services that are important to delivering some new innovation, also have to be prepared to be able to handle that release and handle the rollout and handle the adoption and handle the support. Having realistic timelines for product launches is critically important. Again, drives the need for strong estimation. There's relationships that are important to servicing from an estimation perspective. The stakeholder confidence, being able to have stakeholders say to a technology group, what do you think it's going to take to deliver this, and to be able to come back with a reasonable estimate, and and hit that starts to create a real confidence and trust with your stakeholders, right? So, and it's also some, there's risk, right? When you do our estimation process, you can identify when things are large or complex, and identify those things early so that we can reduce the surprises later. And then really another one I would call out as far as why estimation is important is using estimation as a means for controlling the demand that's put onto any given team ensures that we aren't overloading and that our pace for delivery remains sustainable. So, and that's not a comprehensive list. There's lots of other reasons why estimation is critically important. And the other thing that's, I think, important to say is that most companies I've been with, large and small, and I've worked with or worked for, struggle. They struggle with predictability. And I said this in a previous episode, and I'll say it again. Any work that is truly innovative is building things that may have never been built before. And innovation is a creative process. And so there's a significant amount of uncertainty to that. So it's very hard to be predictable. Now, what I want to talk about today is that it's not impossible to be predictable. In fact, I think it's possible to be very good at predicting these things, because we, in this model that we promote here, in this agile model, we promote accounting for the variability and accounting for the discovery and accounting for all these things that make the creative work so, sometimes so mysterious or so unpredictable. Okay. So let's start by talking a little bit about where the estimation happens. And I want to cover top to bottom. I think that the team level we'll talk about first is where you see a lot of focus from agile groups. And because the estimation is really built into team level practices, whether it's Scrum or Kanban, a lot of the stuff is represented well there. And I'll talk about that. Where I see a lot of struggle with organizations when you get above those teams, or you get multiple teams working together, and you get up to a portfolio level where you're now talking about large initiatives and epics and things. There's a real mystery, I think, for a lot of organizations on how to do estimation at that level. And I want to talk about that as well. So, but the team level, I think, is important because it establishes really a couple concepts that are so important for doing estimation. And the first one is relative estimation. And it's this idea that we're going to determine the size of something or the effort of something by comparing it to something we've done in the past. And what this does is it creates this relationship where our sort of future performance is predicted based on evidence of how we performed on something similar in the past. So empirical evidence of what something really would take, and use that to estimate something in the future. And it's actually not that hard for people to look at something and say, all right, we don't know all the things that are involved in this. We don't know every little detail about this thing we're about to build or about to create. But we can usually look back in our history and say, this sort of feels like that other thing. Or this feels a little bigger than the other thing, a little smaller than the other thing. And in truth, that's often enough to be able to give us a framework for estimation. In fact, what I would say, and I've seen graphs and charts over the years to sort of prove this out, is the reality that there's a point of diminishing return for estimation. The deeper you go, the more detail you create. There's a point where you can, I don't care how deep you go in trying to define every single little thing that needs to be done and give it an estimate. It does not produce estimates that are more accurate than the ones we got doing lightweight relative estimation. In fact, the downside is you will spend a lot of extra time trying to do that, which isn't worth it. And then, when the discovery process, which it happens always, when the discovery process, as we get into this and start learning things and discovering things, we're constantly it's adaptive estimation, it's adaptive planning. We're constantly going and saying, based on what we learn now, when we know more information now, looking at our plan, is it still accurate? And how would we adjust that? So again, all that extra effort at the front end doesn't help. And then, for some other reasons in sort of the agile principles and practice, we also don't want to do all that at the front end for everything anyways, because our plans and our needs and our prioritization will change. And when other things come and move up the list, now the work you've done in trying to get lots of refinement and definition to things that are not even on the plate yet is just wasted effort. And again, slows down the overall time to market. But relative estimation is critically important. And it's done a couple different ways. Teams will often use something called story points. And for that, we have a pointing system where generally using what we call the Fibonacci sequence, this series of numbers where each subsequent number added to the previous represents the next number. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, etc. We don't take it much higher than that because one of the principles we're really pushing for in estimation and value delivery in general, iteratively, is to make things small. Small because, one, they're quicker to deliver and all the benefits that go along with that. Also small because they're much easier to estimate. It's easier to predict what I could do in a day versus what I can do in a month, right? So smaller is easy to estimate. So one model is using story points. Many organizations will also use t-shirt sizes, and some organizations, and I actually love this model, will take t-shirt sizes and assign to them behind the scenes the Fibonacci numbers. And I love that, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but I love that because when you start looking at features and higher level sort of roll-up items, you get the chance to do some math around them and start to produce some throughput measurement at a Agile release train level or at a tribe level or whatever your team of teams is called. So t-shirt sizing is another one. And the story points, the other thing that's important to story points is that it's an abstract number that represents a lot of different things, right? It doesn't just represent, it's not certainly not the number of hours that we're going to spend on something. That's in fact a major anti-pattern to try to estimate in hours, but it represents some measure of things like complexity, things like uncertainty. There's more uncertainty to something, or we don't really know a lot about this particular area, or we've got some new skills that are required to be able to do this. We estimate things higher. So, all of these different sort of these considerations go into a single number. And the less unsure about things we are, the higher we'll score it, the larger the number we'll get. And in many cases, when we start to see things with a much higher score, as we're doing estimation on stories, we know to break things down into smaller pieces, which we can then get more information on and come up with better estimates. So, and from that, as we start, assigning points to things, and then we start delivering those things, and this is, I really like this aspect of it, is that when we deliver things, we then can do some math to say, how many points did we deliver in this 2-week sprint? And start to look at a trend. How many points do we deliver the next sprint? And after a couple of 2 or 3 sprints, we start to see some stabilization. This team typically delivers 35 story points in a sprint. And now as we look at our backlog and we do some very lightweight estimation as far as the pointing goes, we can start to see, well, we think this will take roughly 3 sprints to deliver some larger feature. Again, just to be clear about that, we deliver stories completely within our sprints, but these stories typically roll up to some larger feature. If we were building a car and we were building power windows, you might have smaller stories that say, hey, as a driver, I want to press this button and see the window go up until it closes and I'm protected from the rain. Those smaller functions would be good examples of what stories might be. But as the stories are delivered, we ultimately deliver a feature that is power windows. And so as we start to see the velocity at this 2-week sprint level and the team level, we start to get some idea of what it would take to deliver larger features, and we can start to forecast at a higher level there as well. So, and we call that our velocity, right? So we can calculate the velocity or throughput essentially of these teams. Now, in a Kanban model, it could be very different. The Kanban model focuses more on sort of a commodity approach, and it works well when you've got a domain of work that can be easily broken down to similar sized items. Break things down into stories that can be delivered consistently in one day. And then it's not a function so much of going story by story and saying, how many points is this? It's just a matter of this team, because these stories are the same size, will deliver so many stories in a given period. And it, could be a model where you're defining a period like 2-week sprints, or it could be just a pure Kanban model where we're just watching ultimately cycle time, and cycle time tells us this many items would get through, and we'll sort of see where that would put us in the backlog. So there's even estimation there. We're not estimating the given story. We're not estimating the given work item, but we are ultimately watching, breaking these things down to small pieces, which in itself requires some effort to do, some work to do to be able to get things down small. But we're then ultimately just watching these things go through the system, making sure the system functions well, and then we can predict, because we've got consistent throughput, consistent cycle time, we can predict how long it takes to get through a backlog of things. So some larger initiative represented as a long list of things to deliver, we can still forecast and say what that would likely take. So it's important. Now at the team level, there's some advice I would give, and I think the goal of this podcast isn't necessarily to try to, hopefully there's some education value to it, but it's not a training course. I'm not trying to teach folks how to do it, but I do want to try to make sure I'm calling out some tips and things to understand why you do it. And some of that means I'll talk about how you do some of these things so I can provide some tips on how to do them well. The biggest thing around the team level estimation practice is one, keep it simple. More time is not generally, doesn't generally translate into better estimates. And when you get into a team situation, if you've got a team that's using story points, and we're doing that right, and I'll talk about planning poker here in a minute, but in situations where you've got folks that are saying, oh, I think it's a 3, and some saying it's a 2, in those kind of situations, my advice is always just take the 3 and go. Don't spend a lot of extra time when you've got a gap here of 1 point difference. As you start getting some different opinions where you get some folks saying that something is 13 points and some folks saying it's 1, that's a different situation. But the idea is it's not meant to be a very heavyweight process. So the second thing is it is a team exercise. And this is where I think a lot of folks do an Agile or trying to do Agile or thinking they're doing Agile miss things. Agile is a team process. It's a team practice. All of this stuff is team-based. And what that means is how long it takes for something to deliver is how long it takes for something to deliver from the team, not one person. In fact, one of the bigger anti-patterns we see all the time is teams of 5 or, God forbid, 10 people who are just dividing the work up, 10 people doing 10 different things. And it's the work is owned by one person, and maybe estimates are being done by that person who's going to do the work, or you're letting, maybe there's one expert in the team on a particular type of work, and then they're the ones estimating it. All of those are anti-patterns. The idea is we're going to estimate as a team what it would take us to deliver this together collectively. And in fact, there are other behaviors that are important to that, which is we don't divide up the work. And that doesn't mean we can't do more than one thing at a time, although there are, we call those WIP limits. There are limits to how much you should be doing at a time. And we should really be swarming things and working down a list and delivering the most important thing, and then delivering the next most important thing. And when we do that with some WIP control and practices like pairing and swarming and things like that, then we are truly delivering as a team, and the estimate as a team is appropriate. The velocity of the team is representative of that team. That's really, really important. And so when you do estimation, it's a team exercise. Now there's a game called planning poker, which I think is terrific as a means of the team working together to decide what something should be from a story point number. And generally what happens is if you're all in the same place, which is ideal, but not realistic these days, each person has a set of cards that like a deck of poker cards, but on those cards instead are numbers representing the Fibonacci. And so you'll have the 1, the 2, the 3, the 5, the 8, the 13, and then it goes off the Fibonacci to 20 and sometimes 50 and infinity. And the idea is you're not going to need those on the high end. If you're honestly estimating things that high, then the first job is to get those things into smaller pieces that actually can be estimated realistically and small to deliver in a sprint. So the product owner will describe the story. We'll take the team through what the intent is. The team has the opportunity to ask a lot of questions and they get some clarity around what they're trying to do. And at the end of that, on the count of three, everybody throws a card down. And we look and see, okay, that person put a 1 card down and that person put a 3 and a 5 or everybody put a 3. Great. If everybody puts a 3 down, then it's a 3 and we move on to the next one. If you have a situation where someone puts a 13 and someone puts a 1, we need to understand the differences. And this is important too, because when you work as a team in estimation, you've got various perspectives. Maybe the experts is saying, well, it's going to take this long, but maybe the person that doesn't know a lot about it will bring a fresh perspective. Well, what if we did it this way? Well, when maybe the team hadn't thought of that, right? So you'd be surprised. It's an anti-pattern to just let the person that maybe knows the most about the type of work to estimate it. You want every opinion to be considered, and if they're way off as far as the numbers they put, let them talk it out. And then pick up the cards again and then throw them and vote again until the team collectively agrees. And now you've got a commitment that's going along with this. And I said commitment is probably the wrong word. You have a consensus, or at least a commit that the team says, we all agree, we are validating collectively that we all understand this work and we believe this is about how big it is, okay? I'm sort of using the word commitment softly because the other thing that's important to any conversation around estimation is it is not generally made to be a commitment. It's meant to be a forecast. It's meant to be a prediction, right? And we will get better and better and better at doing that, at being able to predict this stuff reliably. But we want to be very careful of not creating a sort of false certainty because we don't know everything about these things and there's discovery and we're going to have to course correct and do all these things. So we want to be very careful. But the message here is that estimation is based on team consensus. And the recommendation is use planning poker. If you're working in a model of say, Scrum, where you've got things coming in of different sizes and you're working within a time box and you're story pointing, then planning poker is a great way to do that. So in the consideration of time, let's move on to talking about estimation beyond the team. So, and there's lots of material out there you can find on story pointing and planning poker and team level estimation. We're not trying to cover all of that, but when you get beyond the team, it starts to get a little bit dicey. One, because you're moving to larger items, which we've said once already are harder to estimate, right? And we're going to, you go all the way up to the largest initiatives, and it's very, very difficult to estimate. In fact, what usually happens, and this is, if I had to pick my biggest pet peeve of all the years I've been working in technology delivery, it's this scenario where an organization, someone in a senior position, basically makes up a date and says, we have this thing and that we need, and it's a big initiative, and we want it done by June of next year, without understanding anything about what it's going to take to do that. And I personally think it's likely this concept, this sort of management idea that by putting a date, we're going to motivate people, because this idea that if you never, if there's no sort of timeline on something, that people will take however long they want to take, right? And obviously, there's concern that would put the company in a very bad position. So we'd just create a date, create a sense of urgency, and that would drive people to work harder than if there were not a date. But what really happens is the date is made up without any real evidence of its realisticness. And companies with great teams, teams that are really good and capable and qualified, if the estimate isn't realistic, can cause a very good team, a very good organization to fail. And that's not fair, right? And when that happens, it's demoralizing for the team. It's bad for the person that made the promises, that made the dates, because they're they've failed too. So it's a bad situation. But the concept that having a date motivates people, that's true. I mean, there's truth to that. But what I would say is we bake that in at the right place. When we get down to where the work is done with the teams and we're doing the estimation, we're doing it within time boxes. So we're saying, what can we realistically deliver in this period? And we get very good at that. And we can forecast much farther than just beyond the period. But we are creating a commitment and we are creating energy and engagement around delivery when all of a team says, yeah, we believe we can do these 5 things within this time box, and then we go after it. So that motivation is actually much stronger. It's collective ownership within the team, and people that they're doing the work, they were able to say what it would take. They're closest to the information. They understand it best, which means their estimates will be much more accurate anyways. We've given them the ability to tell us, to define for us. And that's a much better model for success. But so what does that mean when you're at the top with a new initiative that's big and we know very little about what it really is going to take? How do you do it? And here's how you do it. Here's the answer to that question. It works in many ways just like we do at the team level. The first thing is we think back on something else we've done that feels like this new thing, right? And I coach organizations to use t-shirt sizing for their epics, and to as you get this mental model in place on what's an example of a large epic or an extra large epic or a medium epic, and we have this mental model created on our history, and the history where we think back on these large initiatives that we've done, we can create this model that even tells us things like that. A medium epic for us typically costs between $1 million and $1.5 million and will typically be delivered within 5 to 7 program increments. Programs for these 10-week time boxes we use for higher level planning. So again, it's not a commitment, but when you don't have any other thing to go on, it's a pretty good place to start, right? Because we're using history to predict future performance, which is good. We often have to understand what we think costs, and we're using a range. This is the other part that's so important. At that point, it needs to be a range, okay? And we can take it farther. We start off saying this is a medium, and a medium means roughly, typically this much time, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, that kind of thing. And it's going to cost between $1 million and $1.5 million. Then what I like that not a lot of organizations do, oftentimes the way they bridge the gap between the epic estimate and the team level. I remember there's a couple levels down. Typically, when you're working in SAFe, you've got a agile release train. Sometimes you got a solution train. Sometimes you get multiple levels, teams of teams, before you get down to where the actual work happens at the agile team level. But how they bridge that often is that range where we said, it's going to likely take, between this amount of time, maybe, 5 to 8 program increments, and it's going to cost between $1 million and $1.5 million. That can translate also to a range of story points. So, a medium for an organization might be somewhere between 800 and 1,000 story points. And if that's the range, and they can often then even do the math and say, well, okay, these agile release trains that will deliver this thing, they're typically doing 150 story points a PI, and they can do the math and say it's going to take this many program increments. So you can do that. What I like, though, that not many organizations do, and I this to me is a kind of a secret. I think it's a little bit of a secret thing. I don't know why more people don't do this. It's wonderful. Is the next level down, the feature level down in SAFe, gives us the ability to do similar estimation just at the feature level instead of the story level. And usually the second thing that happens in these large epics, these large initiatives, is they're going to break it down into features. So if the epic is we're going to build a car, And then we start, the product folks start really thinking about what needs to be in it. Oh, it's got to have cruise control. It's got to have power windows, power doors. And we define these features. Well, when you do that, now you've got another level of sort of specificity to go down, do some estimation. All right, that's a medium feature. That's a large feature. Same model, which is looking at features, mental model that says that's roughly, the size of a medium or the size of that feature's, small, etc. And, the t-shirt size, you can apply Fibonacci numbers behind the t-shirt size to the features and say, look, this is probably 150 feature points. I'm sort of making that word up, but 150 feature points. And I can look at the Agile release trains that will deliver these and know that they're delivering 35 feature points per PI. And I can get a next level of detail down estimate for how long things will take and maybe even what things will cost. Because now also the idea of feature points, I know what my Agile release train costs for the year. I know what their average throughput is in a year on feature point delivery. I know what a feature point costs now, essentially. And so, I can even do cost estimation at the next level down by saying, 150 feature points, cost per feature point is typically this. Now I know what I think it's going to cost. That feature list and the t-shirt sizing and the look against feature throughput delivery is more specific. It's more detailed. It's more accurate than what we started with, which was the epic against, looking at other epics. And then as we go, now, once the features start getting broken down into stories, we can then check ourselves. We can check ourselves against the higher level. And of course, every time we cycle, we can then forecast out and adjust and make it more detailed and more clear. And that's what I think is the part missing for a lot of organizations is doing that, is estimating properly using this sort of relative stuff at the top, and then as more information becomes available, refining it, and then as it gets down to the teams and we get down to the story level, refining it cycle over cycle, PI over PI, sprint over sprint. Now, and again, we can forecast, right? We can forecast and say, based on what we know, we think this will take this many PIs. And the key is, again, it needs to be treated not as a commitment. It's not a drop dead date. This isn't a false sense of certainty where we're going to just make a drop dead date, but we are going to recognize this adaptive planning and we're going to adjust as we go. And we're going to find out as early as we can how this stuff will change. And the other critical piece to doing estimation is the prioritization part of it, because again, companies who maybe have a need to be able to have a defined date, we're going to have, maybe you're not great at releasing frequently and you only have 1 or 2 releases a year, which is a whole different problem. But if that's your scenario and you have to do it sort of at a certain time, okay, that's great. But if we prioritize things the right way and we're wrong, I mean, we still did the most important stuff first. So all along we were, moving from the most important to the next important to the next important. And when we got close to that date, and if there's a drop dead date for release, if we've been operating in a truly agile model, with iterative delivery and discrete releasable features as we went, it's just a function of saying, look, when do we draw the line to hit this particular date? And if we're only going with 80% of what we hope to get, great. It's the most important 80%. The last 20% is likely the least important and not as painful to not include, or you make the decision to delay the date. Again, it comes up to what it's going to, a business decision around, are we ready to release? And by the way, if you're in that place where you're only releasing a couple times a year, it should be a goal to be able to release more frequently, which can be done. And even companies that are doing things that have a lot of regulatory considerations and things like that, it can be done. It can be done because all of that quality and regulatory stuff can and should be baked into these cycles. So you're always releasable and safely releasable based on regulatory needs if you're doing it as you go. And in some cases where there's some additional regulatory work to be done at the end, you just have to work backward from the date and leave a little bit of time. right? And if that time to get all that regulatory work is very unwieldy, you're probably not shifting enough stuff left. You're probably likely still in too much of a waterfall model. And the other consideration should be, how do we make that last cycle, that sort of final validation piece, much smaller? Okay, so the couple of topics, a couple sort of elements of this, I want to make sure that are clear on sort of what they mean, right? So one is capacity and velocity. These two names are thrown around a lot, and I want to make sure we understand the difference. Velocity is essentially the trend or the average sort of value delivery that the team is creating, is delivering. Capacity is how much do we, sort of capability do we have at any given time to do that. And the reason I call those out as different is because you do have fluctuation in both, but they're typically different things. Capacity fluctuation is normal. People take time off. So in estimation, there are some consideration for capacity. Now, usually the way that would manifest is that if the team is typically delivering 35 points, 30 points in a sprint, and we have these sort of mental models so that, a 5 is a 5 and an 8 is an 8 to our team. We all have this idea of what those are. You're not changing those. But if people are going out and a number of people are out, you'll likely reduce your expectation on what you should commit to. So if we typically say we got 35 points, but a couple folks are out, we're going to commit to 30 points this sprint, right? So capacity is important as a consideration for what we commit to in a given sprint. Velocity is important for us to look at the trends and evaluate sort of our accuracy, to find underlying challenges that might exist. When we see changes in velocity, we want to go look and say, all right, do we understand why that changed? Why did the velocity change? And some say they're good reasons. Often when we're coaching organizations to do more things with test-driven development, or maybe shifting things left, well, that can actually cause things to take longer to deliver. It pays dividends in the long term, and time to market actually increases, but it may make, suddenly we went from 35 points to 30 points of delivery. And as long as we know why, and we say, yeah, that's a good thing, we added some good stuff there, great, right? If it's going if it's going down and it's not for a good reason, it's for a bad reason, then the teams, through continuous improvement, should be looking at that and saying, what are we learning here in our continuous improvement model, and how do we get better and better? And teams will get better and better. And we will often see some velocity improvement just because teams are getting better and they're cross-training, and more people know how to do this stuff well, and they're learning. And we're doing things the second and third and fourth time, which we just get better and more proficient at it. So you'll see that. But a caution for anybody looking at velocity, which comes out of this estimation stuff, it should really never be used as anything other than a forecasting tool and a tool for the team to continue to improve. A lot of organizations don't get this stuff, and they will look at that and say, well, you're doing 35 points, I want 40 points. And that's the wrong way to do it. That's a major anti-pattern, will drive the wrong behavior. So spikes and uncertainty. As I mentioned earlier, this story pointing concept, estimation, includes things like uncertainty and complexity and things like that. And when you're doing stories and estimating stories where there's some uncertainty, one of the things we encourage you to do is to break them down into smaller pieces. If you're scoring something high because there's a lot of uncertainty, consider breaking it down into smaller pieces. One of those pieces is maybe a spike to go figure out what you don't know. Figure out, we just don't know what this is. So we're going to make a small spike to go and sort of get some answers so that we can provide a much more reasonable estimate. Just pulling that uncertainty out, breaking it, moving it forward, and then spend the time to get more clarity will help make sure the subsequent estimates that come out of it are better. And by the way, if you have a spike in your plan, you would estimate the spike too. All right, it's a 3-point spike to go and figure this out, right? So, and dependencies can have a big impact on estimation. So how do you do it? I mean, in SAFe, we have exercises like PI planning, program increment planning, where we all plan together, multiple teams plan together, so that, specifically that, so we can manage dependency. What we don't want is, team estimate is, this is going to take us a sprint to do, or a couple sprints to deliver this backlog, but there's another team doing something and they don't deliver their part when they should, and now, even though we did our part, the ultimate value delivery doesn't happen, or is greatly delayed. So the most important thing about dealing with dependencies is, one, remove it when you can, right? Build your teams around value delivery in a way that has the least amount of dependency. If you're going somewhere else for other things all the time, consider changing your makeup. But there will always be some dependencies within Agile release trains and teams of teams. And PI planning is a great way to make sure that people are scheduling things in a way so that those dependencies are well managed. Okay, so that's dependency management. Now, how do you estimate in distributed teams? Because that's the reality we live in, where our workforce is global in many cases and distributed all geographically all over the place. My only advice to that is, there's a lot of capability available to still make it feel as much like co-location as it can, right? Use video conferences to simulate being in the room together. And force folks, as much as you can, to turn their camera on and be present and try to operate as if you're co-location. Because back in 2001, when they did the Agile Manifesto, they knew that co-location was important. In fact, that was one of the things they were really promoting, but it's not realistic. So do what you can to sort of create the feel of co-location. There's also lots of tools. Planning Poker, I mentioned earlier. I think there's a site called planningpoker.com. Lots of boards, Miro boards and whiteboards and things, and lots of online tools you can use to do Planning Poker distributed as well. And then people need to be involved. So the idea of sort of voting at the same time is important because it eliminates bias. You're not, if you're doing things where one person is voting and everyone sees it, they often can be influenced by that with how they vote. So you need to do it together. You need to do it in a way that everybody can vote at once. I've seen some teams even using a chat tool, just say 1, 2, 3, go, and they would write the number in the chat and hit enter at the same time. So whatever you can do to make it as much like that as possible. Again, let me call out two anti-patterns that come up in this model. One, treating an estimate as a commitment is an anti-pattern, and then over-engineering estimation sessions. Just again, you don't want to do math. We're not trying. We definitely don't want to try to equate hours to points. There's an algorithm that we use when we launch Agile release trains, which actually does do that math to start, in the sense that we say, find an item that you could build and test and deliver in one day, and call that a 1, and estimate everything else against that. That's sort of a starting point for your mental models. And we also say, for a team, give each person on the team, each working person on the team, 8 points, assuming we're in a 2-week sprint. Give them 8 points and add those up and use that as your starting velocity. So if it's 5 people, 8 points, we say our 40 points is our starting velocity. We'll take an item that we can do in a day. We'll call it a 1. We'll estimate things against that. It's bigger, a little bigger, a lot bigger, 2, a 3, a 5, an 8. And we'll commit to the first sprint up to 40 points. And then we'll see what we deliver. And if now we deliver 35 points, then the next time we'll probably likely commit to 35 points. But that's the starting point. And once you get past that first sprint, you never look back. You never go back and do any kind of like points and hours and things like that. You don't want to do that math, right? It's simply based on building shared mental models. Okay, so we're coming up on time, and we try to keep these episodes at an hour if we can. But let me sort of call out what I think the key takeaways I think would be for this. The first one, estimation it's about forecasting. It's not precision. And I think you have to recognize that in innovative and creative work, there is a lot of uncertainty, and the smartest companies will be the ones that acknowledge that, they lean into that, and they adopt a model that allows them to adjust dynamically. Stop making commitments in a vacuum. because you're just setting yourself up for failure. And as often as you can, push decentralize some of this stuff, the decision making, down to the teams where the work is being done, closest to the information. Let the teams tell you what it's going to take, and don't be afraid to do that, because people think, well, if I let them say, they'll just say it's going to be take for however long they want. That's not true. There's lots of other things that we can certainly talk about in subsequent sessions, or if you're a customer of Elastions, we can talk about how teams are motivated and how things like collective ownership and social accountability help ensure these teams are not doing that. They're not sandbagging. And you create an environment where they're going to work diligently, and let them determine what it's going to be. Let it sort of connect it, right? So connect it so it's very visible in backlogs and other things, so everybody can sort of see this and we can forecast based on that. That's a much better model for success. The second takeaway: relative sizing is much better than trying to do time estimates. I remember back in the day doing big work breakdown structures and trying to get every little piece of thing we're going to do and give it hour estimates. It was never accurate. We were off. I mean, the first weekend we were off and likely never got back on. It's not worth the time to try to go to hours. And honestly, when you think about hours, it takes away from some of the other practices that are so important, like pairing, that help drive quality into the product early. So when you work as a team and you're not focused on who's doing how many hours and things like that, and we're swarming things, and you can do things like pairing to bring quality in early and prevent recidivism and things that come back at you, it's a much better model. The relative sizing says also history is going to dictate future performance, which is the best predictor, right? The history will always be the best predictor of future performance. This leverages that. The third key takeaway: estimation is team-based, not individual. Make sure that the teams are working together, delivering together, pairing, swarming, delivering in a serial way with whip controls, and they're all participating in estimation. And then when we look at what the team is producing in throughput and forecasting, it should be team delivery, okay, team-based. Next takeaway: velocity is a trend, not a commitment. And its greatest use is ultimately allowing teams to improve, teams to be able to look at it, understand what they're capable of delivering sustainably, understanding when they're doing better or doing worse, and being able to adjust to that. But ultimately, velocity is a trend, not a commitment. The next takeaway is focus on value, not just effort. And what this means is the estimation, as I mentioned early, estimation is a critical element to how we make business decisions and how we invest things. So understanding what something is going to take will help us make the right decisions on the best profile and the best prioritization for the things we can do for the organization, right? And we're really focusing on what we're going to deliver, the value of what we're delivering, not just the effort. Okay, next takeaway: avoid false certainty, right? Even though we're using a lot of numbers and things like that, we want to be very careful that we're not giving this impression that we know exactly how this is going to go, because we don't. It just means that we're good and we're getting better at recognizing the uncertainty, adjusting as we go. And the end result of all of this is that teams that get good at this, they are very predictable, even in a space that is very unpredictable by nature. Okay. The next takeaway: break down work for better clarity. Smaller the thing is, the easier it is to estimate. And the example I used earlier was, I can tell you what I can do in an hour, for sure, more than what I can do in a day. And I can tell you likely what I'll accomplish in a day more than I can tell you what I'll accomplish in a month, right? So the shorter the duration, the shorter the thing, the smaller the item, the easier it is to understand, and the easier it is to estimate. Okay. Now, estimation evolves with learning. So as the teams work together and there's cross training and they're working and getting better, this stuff will change. The mental models will become more cohesive. Sometimes as you start to shift things left, things may grow, or it's an abstract concept of story points, and It'll shift, but it's relative and it's abstract in the sense that a team that delivering 45 points or a team delivering 35 points, they may be delivering the same amount of value, but their models are slightly different. That's fine. And if normalization is important to you and your organization, there's things we can do to help make normalization sort of happen organically. But understand, these numbers are abstracted by design, and that's not sort of how we measure team performance. Don't weaponize estimates. These are planning tools, not performance metrics. Okay, again, this is the thing where if we have to recognize the variability, and we don't want to basically, well, you said there's going to be exactly this number. That's not fair, and that's not the way to go on. And then continuous refinement is important. We didn't really talk about this, but baked into our process should be keeping our backlog well refined, sort of just in time and ahead of the teams, so that what they're getting to estimate is clear and reasonable. I've been with organizations where the inputs were really bad, and it was very hard for a team to estimate what it was going to be. So we got to make sure your inputs are strong too. Different topics, which I hope we'll cover here in future sessions, sort of the inputs and how to build good stories and build good features and things like that, including how to use AI for some of that, which is nice, and how we incorporate some of that. So that's it for today and this estimation podcast. I hope this was helpful. I hope maybe there was some tips or some learnings that you'll find useful as you take back to your organization. With all of our podcasts, we really want to encourage folks to engage with us. I'm certainly available, I think, through the podcast, and as we publish these things, we have links and you can click on to reach us, to reach me personally or other folks with Alashant that can help answer questions. We really like to see active forums. If you have a question, then we have comments, I think, enabled for the podcast on our site, and post a comment, post a thought, and we'll be glad to respond to it and keep the conversation going and keep the sharing of experience and knowledge going beyond just the time we've spent here together today. So again, thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast. It's available on all of the streaming services. And the link, of course, to the alashant.com site has the ability to be able to subscribe. We have the ability to send notices right to your inbox as new content becomes available. And we've got a lot of additional content planned coming up in 2026. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.